This is David Olson with the Press Enterprise. I'm here with Reza Aslan, who's Associate Professor of Creative Writing here at UC Riverside. And first of all, Professor, how did you end up here at UC Riverside and also in creative writing? Because obviously you have a pretty diverse sort of background in terms of your degrees and in terms of your scholarly interests.
Yeah, I have an MFA in creative writing
Uh-huh.
and have taught at the University of Iowa in creative writing and was living in Los Angeles and had stopped teaching at my previous position in Iowa. And the opportunity came to join this department, and I jumped on it. It's something that I really enjoy very much.
I'm going to your best-selling book here, Zealot, which obviously, when I talked with you last, it was in the middle of the whole maelstrom over the Fox News interview. Obviously, the Fox News interview helped, like a lot of times these things backfired, and I don't know if you can say backfire, but obviously helped probably sell some books, gave you a lot of attention. But I remember at the time, this was right at the beginning, you talked about how you were welcoming some of the discussions that were happening as a result of this quote-unquote controversy. Looking back almost 3 months later now, what do you see as the best thing that came out of that whole controversy and all that was written about it and all that was discussed about it?
Well, a couple of things. One, I think that the question about media bias and journalistic integrity is a good one, and one that we need to have more often in this country, particularly as our media has become more calcified and polarized. But I think from an academic perspective, it goes back to what we were just talking about. I think there's been a very interesting conversation in academia about the perils and the promise of actually engaging a broader audience. I think that what happened with me on Fox News has encouraged a lot of younger academics particularly to be less afraid to actually engage the public. And that's, I think, probably the best thing that's come out of it.
Now, as you know, there have been some people who've questioned, this is something you might have been asked for, about questioning some of your credentials. I actually talked with Professor Martin over at Yale today, and he uses words such as oversells credentials and things like that, and this has been brought up. Well, not just by the conservative media, but also by some folks like Professor Martin. Any response to that?
I mean, not really. I mean, my credentials speak for themselves. Professor Martin spends his entire life poring over a single text of the New Testament, and I study the world's religions. And so I think he thinks that somehow that makes him more of an expert than it makes me. I do find it interesting that, this is not the first book on religion I've ever written, and no one had ever questioned my credentials before.
No.
And all of a sudden now, people start questioning my credentials, but my credentials speak for themselves. I mean, every university that's ever taught me and every university that's ever employed me has already answered these questions. So I'm not sure what it means to oversell, but again, this goes back to the problem of academia, doesn't it? Professor Martin's review in the New York Times said that his book on Jesus was better than mine, which is essentially all that this is about. I think that maybe it was Henry Kissinger who once said that the politics of academia are so vicious because the stakes are so small.
And one of the things that I don't want to belabor the point, but I know that things he said, for example, he doesn't consider you a scholar of early Christianity. You probably heard that, and then
I'm not a scholar of early Christianity.
Okay, so you've never really claimed that in a sense.
No, I'm a scholar of religions.
Yeah.
Now, that includes Christianity and Judaism and Islam. My expertise is in Western religions, which includes Zoroastrianism, Manichaeism, etc. Professor Martin is a scholar of early Christianity. That's all he does, whereas I do the religions of the Western world. My degree encompasses his. His degree does not encompass mine.
It's much more narrow, obviously.
Right.
And then one more thing, and I'll move on from this. I know that there's someone else in the nation who had said that you're not really a quote-unquote historian. Any thoughts on that?
Well, I have 2 degrees in the history of religion, so I don't know what that. Maybe that doesn't make me a historian, but I guess in some eyes it does, and in some eyes it doesn't.
And one of the things I found interesting that Professor Martin had. There were some facts he disputed, but one thing I noticed in the book itself, actually, Zealot, is that you had acknowledged that any biography of Jesus, in the words you use, was best, most educated guess. obviously most of our readers won't have read the book. What do you mean by that?
Well, when you're talking about 200 years of academic debate and discussion about a man that is shrouded in mystery, I think maybe for a general audience, it may be surprising that there are professors who disagree with my academic take, but that's how academia works. We all disagree with each other. If we didn't, then there would only be one book about Jesus.
Exactly.
The difference, I think, of what I've done is that I have cited all the people who disagree with me in the notes section of my book, which, interestingly enough, you brought up the Nation reviewer who openly admitted that she did not actually read the notes section of the book, which I think is I think telling. This debate that scholars have takes place at every level, at every university in the world. I think in this case, because the book has been popular with a general audience, that debate has been a little bit more in the open, but I don't think that that's unusual. That's what scholars do. We debate each other.
And you acknowledge that there are disagreements, up front, basically, in the that's something you'd say very in the first pages of the book.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, this is a field that has been in contention for a very, very long time, and this is true, by the way, of all religious studies, no matter what you're talking about.
Now, what would you say to someone who is a believer? I shouldn't say a believer, but is a Christian, and obviously your book, as well as other books, other scholars have also disputed a lot of things. For example, that the gospel, many things in the Gospels, for example. What would you say to a Christian believer who is, let's say, well, I'm offended because you are questioning my beliefs? Obviously, as you've talked about, there's a difference between being a scholar and I wonder what would you say to a Christian who says that?
It goes back to sort of what you're saying is that I don't think that there needs to be any kind of conflict between faith and history. They're asking different questions. Faith is interested in what is possible. The historian, however, is interested in what is likely. And those aren't always the same thing, but again, they don't necessarily have to be in conflict with each other. They're just two different modes of knowing. So while it is true that this book, from a historian's perspective, does question some very basic fundamentals of belief, I think in a sense that if that actually sort of disturbs someone, then I think that they're asking the wrong questions, really. I mean, really, what is important to understand is that even at the very core of Christianity is this notion that Jesus was also a man, and so this is an attempt to actually talk about the consequences of that belief, because if he was a man, he lived in a very specific time and place. This is a book about that time and place.
Then also, obviously, as a Muslim, you also know God but God, which I think a lot of people forget. I'll sometimes see comments about, oh, he hasn't written about Islam, but obviously that was your first. And it was a bestseller as well.
And I wrote about Judaism in Beyond Fundamentalism.
Exactly. And so you're someone who's obviously, but specifically as a Muslim, how do you reconcile your faith with some of the research you've done? Because obviously I'm assuming there are same sort of thing where you'll find that what the traditions that's been passed down in Islam are not always don't always hold up when you look at it from a scholarly point of view. Any thoughts on that from your own faith? How does that?
My faith isn't in Islam.
Yeah.
My faith is in God.
Yeah.
And Islam provides me with the language, the symbols and metaphors to understand God and the nature of humanity and creation. So I understand religions, all religions, to be man-made institutions. So anyone whose faith is in a man-made institution is by definition in trouble. Religions are supposed to be the means to an end, not an end in itself. And I think that's something that we often forget, regardless of what faith we are. So I have no problem whatsoever reconciling history and faith. And when there is a conflict between the two, history wins.
Same thing in the Quran. In other words, there may be certain contradictions, or just like as in the Bible.
Yeah.
But it doesn't because of your approach to faith. It's not going to cause you to question your faith because it's too different. It's too disparate.
Yeah, I've never understood people who say that I believe in the Quran or I believe in the Bible. Those sentences don't make sense to me. I mean, do you mean that you believe that they exist? Because that's what you're saying. These are not things to believe in. They are signposts to God. They are the path to a destination, not the destination in and of itself. If your faith is in a text, you're doing it wrong.
Mm-hmm. And one of the things, speaking of the text, in No God But God, you write about how the message of Muhammad, and I'm reading from the New York Times review on this, is of being egalitarian, inclusive, progressive, and liberating, how that's been, in a sense, twisted. And it makes me think that that's what a lot of progressive Christians say about Christianity, basically.
I think it's something that you can say about all religions, and it's primarily because we think that prophets create religions. Prophets don't create religions. Prophets are reformers. It's their followers who create religions, which is why there is such a great distance between, say, the teachings of Muhammad and Islam as an institution, the teachings of Jesus and Christianity as an institution, the teachings of Buddhism and the Buddha. You know, I think that in a sense that is a universal phenomenon, but it goes back to what I was saying before. Religions are not divine things. They are man-made things.
And, you know, one of the other things, are there any other comparisons you can make between interpretations of the lives of Jesus and Muhammad? Because both, in a sense, were filled with some contradictions in that both were men of peace who spoke a lot about peace, but neither man was obviously a pacifist either.
Yeah.
I wonder,
again, it goes back to sort of their ultimate goal was a goal of reform.
Yeah.
I mean, what Jesus and Muhammad had in common is that both of them focused far more on economic, social, political reform than they did on religious reform. Jesus's teachings are primarily about the reversal of the social order, about the care for the weak and the poor. Same is true of the Prophet Muhammad. Actually, Jesus said very little theological, and same is true of Muhammad. He was not a theologically minded person. Most of what he talked about had to do with very real, concrete needs of people. And I think that's where their commonalities are really based.
And would you call yourself a progressive Muslim?
I don't use adjectives.
And why not? Because it's sort of just reading into some of the things you've said about Islam. What I've seen, someone would want you to claim that, because obviously there are many, No God But God is about sort of the battle in a sense for Islam, and obviously from what I've read is you think that some of the I'm trying to think. You could probably describe better than me, but that basically, like we were talking about earlier, some of these teachings of egalitarianism and peace have been sort of twisted. Why don't you accept sort of labels like that?
Well, I think that because they are indeterminate, and their definition comes from the person using it. I think my politics are progressive, my social views are progressive, and certainly my politics and my social views are wrapped inextricably to my religious faith. So if you wanted to call me a progressive Muslim, fine.
Right.
But the problem is that these terms like progressive or moderate or radical or extremist are empty terms, that they say far more about the person using the term than they do about the person being described. And so I often find that that's how other people label things that they cannot categorize. For me, I'm not interested in those kinds of adjectives.
But it sounds like you do want Islam to you are. It sounds like, maybe I'm wrong about this, troubled by some of the interpretations of Islam. Is that
for
correct?
sure.
Yeah.
But I'm troubled with interpretations of Judaism and interpretations of Christianity and interpretations of Hinduism and Buddhism. I mean, religion is an infinitely diverse experience, and there are quite troublesome, interpretations of it.
Exactly, and the reason I ask about the progressive Muslim thing, but the Muslims who are progressive, including people I've talked with, obviously want more folks to come forward in terms of that sort of vision, in a sense, and that's why I guess I was asking that, just because I know that there's some folks.
Well, I let my activism and my interpretations, speak for themselves.
Okay.
And if other people want to label them, that's fine.
Now, you obviously are married to a Christian woman, and in the dedication to Zealot, you thank your wife and her family, saying, quote, their love and acceptance have taught me more about Jesus than all my years of research and study. What did you mean by that?
Well, I think that if those who sort of claim to live a life modeled after Jesus have to sort of contend with what those teachings actually mean and the implications of it. And what I can say about my wife's family is that they have this kind of expression of compassion and acceptance and forgiveness and love that I think is the best of what it means to be a Christian, without the baggage that often comes with that.
I don't go into too much detail on when you were an evangelical Christian, but obviously as a teenager, you were an evangelical Christian, and then talked about how, as you explored in a scholarly way, you began rejecting some of those beliefs. But you've said that you model your life after Jesus. For folks who haven't read the book or haven't read some of the interviews with you, what do you mean by that in terms of, because you seem to put
Right.
Jesus on,
Well, I mean, in the model that he provided in how to confront social injustice, how to react to the powers that be, how to respond to those who set themselves up as gatekeepers of salvation. I think that's a model that is as resonant today as it was 2,000 years ago, and it's one that I try very hard to live up to myself.
Why, of all the people on earth, though, is it Jesus, the person you most, if I remember correctly, I think you had said this, you most model your life after? There's Muhammad and there are
Jesus
other...
and my wife.
Yeah, and your wife. And why is that, of all the people? Because obviously there are many, and just off the top of my head, Gandhi, or even today Nelson Mandela, or there's a lot of other people who have done some...
I'd say he's the one I'm most familiar with.
Yeah.
He's the one that I've studied the most. He's the one that I feel most connected to emotionally and academically. And I think that's what does it.
And of all the biblical verses to quote at the beginning of your book, you chose, "Do not think that I have come to bring peace on earth. I have not come to bring peace, but the sword." Out of all the verses, why did you choose that one to put at...
Well, one, because it's one that scholars almost unanimously agree is a historical verse. It's one that came from Jesus himself, and not a lot in the New Testament you can say that about. And two, because I think it's one that defies people's perceptions of Jesus, and that's really what this book is about, is to kind of question the traditional narrative of who Jesus was and what he meant, and to try to provide a different perspective on that.
And what particular about that verse?
Well, again, what you were saying before, this notion that sometimes people think of Jesus as some sort of inveterate pacifist,
Right.
but that I think his views about the role of violence were far more complex than a lot of people assume.
Can you describe that?
Well, this is a man who tells his disciples to arm themselves before going into hiding from the authorities. He's someone who, as the verse itself says, states quite clearly that he is not someone who's come to bring peace on earth, but the sword. That what he is advocating, the revolutionary politics that he is advocating, is one that necessarily leads to force and violence. There is no removal of the Roman occupation from the biblical land without the use of force. And I think that's something that Jesus understood very, very clearly.
And it goes sort of on the same sort of level for people who haven't read the book. Explain by what you mean by the difference between the Jesus of the Gospels versus the Jesus of history.
Well, the Jesus of the Gospels is a construct of Christians. Jesus wasn't a Christian; he was a Jew. The people who wrote about him were Christians. That right there should tell you the difference between the two. One is a historical figure who is a part of the context of his world. The other is an argument about that figure. That's what the Gospels are. They are a theological argument about who Jesus is.
Okay, great. Okay, Professor, I think those may be... Oh, actually, one more question. And one thing I'm actually reading... This has nothing to do with me interviewing you, but I just happened to be, for my book club, reading Lale Khedivi's The Walking, which is sort of, you could probably identify with in terms of Iranians who left Iran in the 70s and early 80s. And it's interesting that there's just a passage literally last night, just by pure coincidence, in which she talked about people during that era of pretending they were Greek or Mexican or Italian.
Sure.
And for, a lot of our readers maybe weren't even, Chris wasn't even born yet.
the
but
early 80s,
the
yeah.
80s, I'm 49, so I remember that very well.
Yeah.
A lot of hatred of Iranians. And describe that a bit, because I know you've talked about how you're trying to pass as Mexican during that era.
Yeah, this was during the height of the Iran
Yeah.
hostage crisis, so it was very difficult to be Iranian in this country, particularly as a 7 or 8 year old boy. And that's right, I pretended that I was Mexican for a good part of the early 80s so that I could absorb and fit into American culture.
How did you do that?
Well, I look Mexican.
Yeah.
I learned Spanish. I grew up in a predominantly immigrant community, surrounded by Mexicans. Reza sort of sounds, Mexican. So yeah, it wasn't that hard.
And as I understand, that is one reason that I know your mom was, I don't know, not observant, but not I don't know if you call her non-observant Muslim.
No,
I know you said she read the Quran,
Muslim, yeah.
but she was a Muslim, but not overly religious, and your dad was an atheist, and I understand you were not religious as a child, became an evangelical Christian. What then, I understand why you left Christianity, in a sense, the belief, but why did you, what attracted you back to Islam? Because you were never religious as a kid, so what...
It goes back to what I was saying. It's simply the metaphors and symbols that Islam provides. That's all religion is. It's a set of metaphors and symbols, and it's just kind of pick those that you're more familiar with, that you're more comfortable with. And the metaphors and symbols that Islam provides to think about God and humanity and the role of the Creator and creation were ones that just rang more true to me. That's all.
One last question. You've obviously written about Islam and Judaism and Christianity to a very general audience. Why do you think it's important for general audiences out there to read religious history? In other words, read about Jesus or Muhammad or from a historical standpoint. Why is that so important for you?
Well, these are religious figures that, of course, have a huge role to play in our societies, in our politics, and in our governments. And I think that rather than sort of talk about removing religion from society, which is a useless enterprise, we should focus more on having a better, more rounded understanding of who these incredible figures are. And I think having a better historical understanding will allow us not just to have a closer connection to our own individual religions, but also to have a respect for each other's religions. I mean, these were, whatever else they were, men and women who lived in a specific time and place. And I think appreciating who they were is the key to having greater tolerance for one another.
What attracted you to studying religion, especially as someone who grew up in a not totally secular, but a somewhat secular family?
I've just always been interested in religion. I mean, I think maybe it had to do with my childhood images of revolutionary Iran, but I think it's something that has always been something that's deeply, deeply fascinating to me.
Okay. Anything else you want to add at all?
No, I guess that's it.
Perfect. I appreciate it. Thank you.